Hello, History 363, the Roman Republic. My name is Michael Taylor. I'm an assistant professor here at the University at Albany. And I remotely will be your instructor as we examine this very exciting period in ancient history. We will start with Rome as a small village on some hills on the Tiber River. We'll talk about the development of Rome as a community. First one ruled by a primitive monarchy. And then after 509, a community that forms a respublica, a public thing, a commonwealth, a non-monarchic polity that is going to eventually form a complicated interplay between an aristocratic political class and common Roman citizens who vote to elect magistrates, pass laws, and judge trials. Now, this republic is for the first several centuries, in fact, riven by serious socioeconomic inequalities. We're going to be looking at how a series of reforms eventually turn Rome into a military powerhouse, one that is capable of conquering not only the Italian peninsula, but eventually the entirety of the Mediterranean Sea. However, the opportunities that this new imperialism creates for some, but not all individuals, the massive influx of slave labor, is going to create new socioeconomic problems that will eventually lead to political violence and dysfunction. And then by the 1st century BC, civil war. And the series of civil wars will ultimately destroy the Republic. And what will rise in its place is a new imperial autocracy under Augustus, which we call the Augustan Principate. This is what we oftentimes refer to as the Roman Empire. So we will be discussing the history of the Roman Republic down to the Battle of Actium in 31 BC. I hope that those who are interested will consider taking my Roman Empire course, which tells the rest of the story. But I hope this will be an exciting course. And of course, one thing that I like to talk about in in-person classes is, why should we study the Roman Republic? I mean, there's dozens upon dozens of interesting and important courses that you can take during your time at Albany. Why linger on the Roman Republic for a semester? Obviously I may be a bad person to answer that question because I've devoted my professional life to studying the Roman Republic, which is actually not only it's actually my research competency. Most of the work that I publish is on the Roman Republic, primarily the Middle Republic, from roughly the 3rd and 2nd centuries BC. But that can kind of give me a myopia. I think this is important just because I decided it was important a long time ago and I haven't looked back. But why should we actually sort of sit and linger on people who lived over 2,000 years ago when we can look around and there are so many pressing problems that we should worry about. Now, on one hand, I think part of studying the humanities more broadly, which I think is more important than ever, even though you're oftentimes being told that the only thing that's important is STEM and science. But we do need to understand, I think, how as human beings we want to understand how human beings work. And one thing that we need to appreciate is the really profound diversity of humanity, that many human beings operate differently than we do, have different worldviews than we do, have different cultural assumptions than we do, and in some ways, that diversity, there's maybe a sense of, okay, we're all human, but also it's appreciating how radically different human beings can be, and that whatever our assumptions as people living in the 21st century are, those may not have been shared by all people. And of course, obviously when we talk about diversity, it's very important to think about the diversity of people in the present, people from different countries, different backgrounds, different religions, different socioeconomic classes, races. I mean, that's very important to appreciate the diversity of the present. I don't think, though, if we want to be humanists, that we should ignore the diversity of the past. that we live in an incredibly weird moment where population is higher than it's ever been, population density is higher than it's ever been. Obviously, the technologies that make our lives possible and convenient and oftentimes quite comfortable didn't exist. And so one way to appreciate the diversity of the human experience is to study the past and realize that people in the past may be actually radically different than the people of today. And that's one reason why I study ancient history. It's really an encounter with an alien world where so much is different technologically, politically, agriculturally, that it challenges our assumptions of how do human systems work, how do human institutions work, how are human interactions governed. Those are very different with the ancient world than they are necessarily with the modern world, and I think that in itself provides an interesting perspective. Now, looking to the past, one reason that I like to study the ancient Mediterranean more broadly, and of course this would include Greece and Rome and North Africa and Egypt, is these are some of the earliest complex societies. And by complex societies, I mean agricultural, urban, with a lot of sort of social hierarchies. But these are some of the earliest complex societies for which we have written records. And therefore we can really do history. We can make inquiries using written sources, the primary sources that survive. And therefore we can ask more challenging questions than we can about many of the societies that have come before, where we do have archaeological records, and again, the study of those societies are not unimportant, but we can ask the kinds of questions about Greece and Rome, and in this case Rome, that we can't necessarily ask about some of the other societies that have come before. So this is kind of our first time that we get a really detailed, rich window into how early complex societies worked. And these societies indeed were not only complex, they were quite prosperous, and probably some of the most prosperous societies that have been around since the development of agriculture. So that's one reason that I think this is a fascinating world to engage with. Another reason is, if you want to understand the more recent past, you might say, okay, I don't care about Greece and Rome. I just want to understand the United States and how the United States looks right now. One of the themes of American intellectual and cultural history is the dominance of the classical world in that history, the reception of the classical world, which means if you want to understand the people who wrote the American Constitution or the Revolutionary generation, these are guys who, for those that go to college, some like Washington don't go to college, but many of them do go to the early colleges in the colonies, like Harvard and Yale and Princeton, William and Mary. They spend their whole time, they spend their whole time reading the classics. They read Cicero, they read Livy, they read St. Augustine. And so, therefore, their own worldviews, how they think about politics, republicanism, state failure, indeed the failure of the Roman Republic, weighed heavily on what we might call the founding generation, was oftentimes filtered through their understanding of the ancient past. And you can look at different examples, many examples of how various Americans up to the present day have tried to use Rome as a metaphor, as a filter, as just a kind of a symbol. Indeed, you can go to probably any bookstore and find a bunch of books. Are we Rome? Are we falling? I don't know if all those are necessarily actually useful, but again, if you want to understand the present moment or various parts of American history, you actually need to have an understanding of the Roman past itself, because that itself has been received and reinterpreted so many times, whether by James Madison or the many who came after. So I think that's another reason that it actually gives you insight to periods beyond just ancient history, because again, almost everyone after the Romans oftentimes devote intellectual energy to understanding the Romans. Now, the period that we're going to be looking at is a period of explosive conquests that sees the formation of empire. And I think that's actually another reason to think about Rome in particular, not just ancient history more broadly, but Rome in particular. And that is to think about empires. Empire is actually one of the dominant modes of sort of political control. Most people historically, or more people historically, have lived under an empire than they have under a nation state. That may be changing now that the populations are so large in the present moment, but historically, empire was the sort of most common mode of governance. And Rome, I mean, Latin literally gives us the term empire. Our English word empire comes from the Latin word imperium. Imperium initially means the right to command, a magistrate's right to command troops in the field. And in some ways, if you understand how various empires work, whether it's Spanish Empire in the New World, the English Empire in the 18th century, America after 1945, we debate whether that's an empire or not, but in many ways, after Rome becomes such a fundamental model for kind of the empire that anyone thinking about imperialism, broader military control, oftentimes looks back to Rome as a model, as a way of thinking. And so therefore, if you're interested in empire more broadly, they say, I don't really care about Rome, I'm more interested in the British Empire in the 19th century. Well, thinking about how the Roman Empire works is actually useful because, again, those guys running the British Empire, who literally, to get civil positions in the British Empire, you had to take a test that showed how good your Latin was. They were thinking about Rome as they thought about their own imperial governance. And also it's just useful for comparisons, to think about, okay, there are different empires through world history. Thinking about the Roman model is a good way to kind of compare and contrast how other empires work. So empire will actually, without question, be a key theme of this course, because the big thing that is happening is the creation of the Roman Empire. If the Roman Empire hadn't been created, colleges and universities would probably not have Roman historians and probably would not offer courses in Roman history. And so in some ways, imperialism is not just a theme of the course, it's the dominant theme of the course. How does Rome come to first control not only Italy, but also the entire Mediterranean? And let's actually think historically. In all of sort of human history, Italy, the Italian peninsula, has only been unified twice. First by the Romans during the Roman Republic, and secondly during the creation of the Italian nation state in the 19th century. So Italy, we may think about Italy as obviously a nation, it's a unity. It's not. For most of human history, various geopolitical configurations, Italy is fragmented. Different groups control different chunks of Italy. So the fact that the Romans are able to unify Italy is in of itself unusual. Now let's pan out and think about the broader Mediterranean. The Mediterranean has only been unified once under a single entity in human history, and that's by Rome. There have been many, many powers, the Damascus Caliphate, Charles V, the Axis powers during World War II, the Venetians, that have tried to unify the entire Mediterranean. They've all fallen short. So this is actually a very rare, it is a one-time thing to actually have a single power manage to unify this huge amount of space, quite variegated space, in fact. And so that itself is a singular thing that we will be thinking about when we think about the nature of Roman imperialism. It's actually a quite remarkable imperial apparatus. Now, we will also be thinking about politics, domestic politics, and a city-state. And this is actually something else that's very unusual about Rome. Most empires in human history are created by monarchies, a king and conqueror who conquers a big empire. And it's easy to tick off the many, many empires that have been created by monarchies: the Achaemenid Empire, the Empire of Alexander the Great, the Ottoman Empire. These are created by monarchic systems. And likewise, the unification of China by warlords fighting and one comes out on top. So this is actually pretty common, that sort of warlords turn into empire builders and then sit atop of an empire. It's very rare for republics to have empires, for non-monarchic systems to have empires. It's happened a number of times, but it kind of, like, you can count it in the pre-modern period, you can count it on about one hand. Athens during the 5th century, Carthage, and then during the Renaissance, Venice and Genoa, and then Rome. And Rome, without question, is of all of these sort of republican empires, is the biggest, the most successful, and the most enduring. So we will be thinking about how does republican politics work in Rome, and I think this is actually also useful for just thinking about the broader problem of how do politics work in any republic, including our own, as we lead up to the election. But we'll be thinking about politics, again, this interplay between a very entrenched, well-established, dare we say, aristocratic political class, and then the common people, who nonetheless, as voters, basically regulate competition in the amongst this political class, assigning who gets to hold office, who gets to hold certain priesthoods, who, if there is a dispute, who potentially gets put on trial or exiled. This is all determined by common Roman citizens as voters. And that interplay is both complex, it's still the exact nature of it is still disputed by historians. So one thing we think about is, how do Roman republican politics work? That's another big theme of this course, particularly since they ultimately become dysfunctional. They're very functional for a while, they then become dysfunctional, and politics eventually degrades into civil war, and that actually destroys the free practice of republican politics. So republican politics, another big theme of the course, and of course, one thing we should be thinking of, those two themes, imperialism and republican politics, really are deeply connected. To what extent does the republican system contribute to Rome being an unusually successful imperial polity? And I suspect that actually those two things are very closely connected, despite the fact that most republican polities are not particularly successful empire builders. We will, of course, also be looking at other themes, the economy, although again, how does an economy work in this imperialist backdrop? The role of slavery, of course, one product of imperialism is human trafficking on a massive scale that brings huge amounts of unfree labor into Italy, and thinking about the consequences that has, as well as cultural contacts. And indeed, one curious thing about Roman imperialism is that oftentimes when we think about imperialism, we think about the imposition of the imperial power's culture as the dominant culture upon the subjects. Here, it's going to work the other way around, that the Romans are going to receive from, in many instances, conquered people, culture, and we'll actually see a Hellenization, the adoption of various Greek cultural forms in architecture, in religion, in dress, in literature, being imported from the imperial periphery and profoundly influencing and changing what the high culture of the imperial metropole looks like. And that itself is also kind of weird, in that, again, usually we think about, we expect that the British are going to be going into India and spreading English and various British architectural forms. We would be sort of surprised if we found British imperial administrators in London talking in Hindu, and yet many Romans are going to be speaking Greek, Greek elite, and reading Greek and writing Greek. In fact, the first history that any Roman writes is written in Greek. So cultural contacts through empire, and also empire as a form of cultural importation, or empire facilitating cultural importation. Another big theme that we're going to look at. So anyway, I hope that even though you're basically watching a lecture that I'm recording in my study, This is not an ideal way to do a college course. I really wish that we were in the same room talking and interacting, and you asking questions and me responding, and that back and forth and that churn is so valuable. And so, let's just say this sucks. You looking at me in my basement after my kids have gone to bed, it's just lousy. But we're going to have to just try to make lemonade from lemons. I hope that these videos will be useful. You will be having a textbook, an excellent textbook. Read it carefully. I mean, this is still, even though we may not be in a lecture, this is still your chance to sit and spend a lot of time reading and learning. And again, the most important part of this course is the time that you're just sitting by yourself in a quiet place, reading the textbook. I'll be uploading some primary sources, mostly from a source book. Read those. Starting next week, you'll be having a short response that you'll be writing to those primary sources. But again, the most important part of the course, you get to watch these videos as I drop them throughout the week, probably 3 or 4 short videos. But the most important part of this course is you reading, thinking. Also, please email me with questions. In many instances, I hope that I can make videos to respond in part to good questions that people ask me. That's one of my favorite things, is when students ask great questions and forces me to come up with a hopefully somewhat decent response. So anyway, welcome to the course, and I look forward to seeing more of you and dropping these videos as we go forward for the next 14 weeks.